thank you very, very much to the Institute for bringing me here. So we'll sit for a while with a couple of pictures of Hanuman, and then I do have slides. When I get to I may get carried away with talking to you, so if I get to talking about movie stars and I've not moved my slides on, give me a shout and remind me to get away from Hanuman and onto the movie stars. We've got them reverse order, obviously. This is old-style Hanuman on your right, of course. And this is contemporary six-pack Hanuman on your left. Some of you may not even remember old-style Hanuman before he got his six-pack, but he used to look quite different, believe me. So the title is about colonial stereotypes in contemporary South Asian masculinities, but I'm going to range around quite a lot. And I want to begin, I'm not entirely sure of my audience or how much I need to convince you of the importance of masculinities in whatever you do, whatever it is, but I'll begin with a couple of moments on that, just in case anybody hasn't really entered into that yet in their own work. So I want to suggest to you that any branch of academic study can benefit from taking on careful consideration of gender. And I want to restate that gender does not mean women. There's a masculinities story, which is very well developed by now, a masculinities literature, and a masculinities angle to almost anything that you will study. It's obviously there when we talk about power, privilege, inequality, oppression. It's there in studies of technology and rationalist modernity. It's there in scholarship on religious life, political life, projects of development, and even international relations. So whatever branch we're in, we can enrich our work by just taking a pause to ask, where is gender working here as a structure, as a dynamic? And what are the outcomes here in my own field, specifically of masculinities, discourses about masculinity, and the processes and outcomes of socializing human people into something recognized as masculinity? What are the effects? So a couple of the angles that we'd be wise to pay attention to. I'm going to just point out 4 key insights that have come to us from masculinity studies and think about the importance of them. So firstly, and very obviously perhaps, masculinity demands a difference from the feminine as kind of principles or organizing dynamics. It's a truism, but we have to return to it again and again to remind ourselves afresh that we must take note of and analyze the ways in which, in our own academic field, some kind of binarized dynamic is at work, which is presented as or put into discourse as a gendered dynamic. And this is very often very implicit, tacit, hidden and disguised, but we will find again and again gendered dynamics called upon to support and influence other processes and forces, and I will come back to that. Second angle to remind ourselves about is to pay attention to the very specifics, the real fine-grained empirical detail of what any specific socio-cultural or historical setting is demanding of the individual humans who have, in a particular socio-cultural and historical setting, been assigned at birth to the male sex, in a binarized system of gender via that famous proclamation, "It's a boy." From that moment, a whole series of things crash down upon the humans who are assigned male, and those people have it incumbent upon them, whether they want it or not, they have to produce consistent, convincing, repeated, embodied performances of masculinity. If they're going to underwrite and support their claims to maleness and to masculine social status, they have to keep doing masculinity all their lives, and the stakes are very high for this. We have notions like failed men, only a boy, a proper man, very manly. All of that reminds us and proves to us that that mere assertion at birth, "It's a boy," that assertion is never enough to guarantee anybody's individual claims to masculinity. And so what we then get as a result is what Roper and Tosh, looking at colonial English masculinities, named as manful assertions. The need for these repeated assertions and demonstrations and performances of masculinity. So Judith Butler, many of you will know, worked that insight out for us very well in the humanities, and it's her 1990 text, Gender Trouble, that's the most well-known landmark go-to text for talking to us about how that binary system works, how binary sex is set up, and how it's then completely tied into a binarized heterosexuality. That's a very well-known text. But we also have some perhaps less well-known texts, which are equally interesting to look at, which explain for lay readers how, and this can be surprising, my students often find this kind of simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Biological sex in humans is not a binary. It's not uncontested by biologists what to put in there. What we call biological sex is an extraordinarily complex set of different biosystems which we have grouped together under a label of sex. It can't any longer be claimed as a natural foundation on which social gendering rests. So Butler persuaded a lot of people in the humanities that the causality runs the other way from common sense discourse, that it's not biosex that produces binarized gender, it's actually binarized gender that makes us see biosex. But there is a whole body of supporting work you might want to look at if you're having trouble persuading people of these arguments, coming from biology itself, from science studies itself. And I'll just mention a couple of names for you there if this is new to you. Anne Fausto Sterling is a biologist who writes for popular audiences and is digestible for those of us who didn't get past SSLC or GCSE science. And Thomas Lacour has done a lot of good work on the history of how biological sex was produced and made a binary. So thirdly, the third thing I want to point up, which is not kind of surprising really, once we acknowledge the non-naturalness of what we call biological sex, something else that masculinity studies work does for us is that it carefully documents and produces really fascinating work around the range and variety of what is considered masculine. And it becomes clear as soon as we engage with that body of work. Oh, let's have Hanneman back, shall we? Come back, Hanneman, come back. As soon as we begin to engage with that work, it becomes very clear to us that what is masculine, what is considered masculine, is absolutely contingent upon culture, society, and history. There is not a one-size-fits-all for all time masculinity. And the historical study of shifts, the ethnographic recording of differences, is a rich field of scholarship where we can wander around whenever we need to remind ourselves that masculinity is not natural, it's not inborn, it's not a side effect of any natural embodiments, as all our ideology and all our common sense knowledges would try to teach us. A couple of names there, of course. Radhika Chopra, many of you will know her work. Michael Kimmel, Andrea Cornwall, Nancy Lindisfarne. I'm just throwing names in case anybody wants to follow up, and I will be handing this over also later. So the last aspect that I'm going to bring in as the 4 points that I want to start out with might seem at odds with the first aspect that I mentioned. I reminded us in my first point that the masculine works as part of a binary system in which the feminine then gets set up as the so-called opposite sex. But probably one of the greatest and most helpful insights which masculinity studies gave us came via the work of Ray Wynne Connell. Connell spawned one of the biggest debates in masculinity studies and one of the most useful conceptual tools, which was the concept of hegemonic masculinities. and the idea that gender and masculinity or femininity, that gender is not actually a binary, but scalar. So a man can, we know this when we stop to pause about it, we know that, as we've said, a man might be considered socially as more or less manly. A woman might display masculine characteristics. The gendered characteristic of masculinity does not naturally necessarily adhere to a male body. Masculinity, then, is a competition about claiming more and more of the features which our own particular moment in history and space in culture would identify and claim as being masculine. So we can have a look in our studies and ask the question of what are the normalised standards of masculinity in this particular field that I'm looking at? What are the hegemonic ideals of masculinity which ordinary human men are supposed to organise themselves around? Hegemonic masculinity, nobody might live up to the standard apart from someone like old Hanneman over here on the left. Nobody may actually live up to a standard of hegemonic masculinity. But we can notice that the ways in which scalar gendering sets a gold standard that mere male-bodied persons then have to aspire to, try to adhere to. And female-bodied persons, in that binary nexus of binary gender, binary sexuality, female-bodied persons are then supposed to fix their desire upon that hegemonic masculine ideal. So the idea of scalar gendering entails much more than a basic binarized demand that we have a masculine which stands clearly apart from a feminine. It calls for some kind of social agreement about what features, what norms are going to be deemed superior, what's going to go into that bag of hegemonic masculinity, what will be expected of the dominant, what will be admired as a manly quality. So scalar gendering then sets up a kind of ladder of masculine achievements and a set of masculine hierarchies, processes and arenas of masculine competition which can go on forever in ever escalating ways. Some of the obvious arenas you'll be thinking: sport, warfare, governing, owning and controlling wealth. These are the kinds of playing fields where hegemonic masculinity tries to come through. But by the end of the talk today, I'm going to suggest that it might be time for some of us to let go of talking about masculinities and even gender, and time for all of us to stop using very broad terms like gender or patriarchy, both for analytic reasons and for pragmatic reasons. But first, we're going to take a very short sidestep across and think empirically about what masculinities meant in colonial and post-colonial nationalist Indian histories. I'm not going to do a lot of empirical run-through here because I think a lot of you will be familiar already with the debates, the literatures and the material. So I've chosen just to give a brief hint for anybody who's stepping into these debates. Early work in post-colonial studies began to notice very quickly the sometimes surprising ways in which gender and race appeared as co-implicated, to the point that race, that artifact of empire and colony, race seemed always to be gendered. Classic works here would include Anne McClintock's Imperial Leather, Ashish Nandy's Intimate Enemy, Revati Krishnaswamy's Effeminism, and Indipal Grewal's Home and Harem. These books all shocked us as they laid bare the very, very crude ways in which the British, under colony and empire, came to believe themselves to be superior in race and in gendering, and painted colonial subjects as immature, unmanly, and hence, of course, unable to govern themselves. And several writers traced out parts of that story about how the British effeminized Indians, with Mrinalini Sinha's 1995, The Manly Englishman and the Effeminate Bengali, of course, a key text. Later writers came in and nuanced this story of the manly Brit and the effeminized Indian, and noted how many communities were hyper-feminized in their specificity, like Bengalis, like the Parsis, but other communities were treated as exceptions. So Sikhs, Gurkhas, Rajputs, Pathans were classified under colonial taxonomic obsession as martial races, put into the military, the police, and so on. Other groups were named as criminal castes and tribes, decidedly masculine, but brutishly so. Not in the allegedly rational, controlled and educated way that the British were claiming for themselves and their own masculinity, and were now insisting was to be a global yardstick. As with other colonial phenomena like caste, the long-running debates around all this finally mostly agreed that the British didn't entirely invent all these demasculinizing or hypermasculinizing stereotypes, but they picked up already existing local ideas about qualities, natures, gunams, we would say in Kerala. I'll always give you the Dravidian version. It would be gunams, which would link phenotype to character, talk about biomoral qualities, and sediment them in the end into fixedness. So the splitting of the Indian masculine self happens under colony, thank you, and gets linked in then to regionalism and to caste, and the solidification of religious identities into communities. And Charugupta's 2005 work, Sexuality, Obscenity, Community, has been a very key text for us in the study of how Muslim Indians came to be hypersexualized and vilified. And when we look at those processes, we can see the complexity of the ways in which the Indian Muslim man came to be held as at once too manly, of uncontrolled appetite, a carnivorous polygamist who fathers many children, but also simultaneously a figure tainted with queerness, a fault allegedly born from spending too much time in same-sex arenas, and increasingly associated with the feminine arenas of art and culture, as those arenas also got gendered as feminine under a British standard for what is masculine, which was obsessed with militaristic and sport standards for masculinity, where art and poetry and music were the realms of the feminine. That tainting of the Indian Muslim with queerness reminds us of the ways in which colonialism also hardened public heteronormativity, with trans forms and queer forms in religion and the arts increasingly purged. That's important for a couple of reasons. It refers us to a pre-colonial history of sexuality and gender queerness, which has been very, very much uncomfortable and very much disavowed and purged from consciousness and public representation. And we might have to do a lot of hard work sometimes to undo our common sense knowledge or to rediscover what was lost and let go of. And a lot of very excellent scholarship has been coming out of India in this regard, much inspired by the excellent landmark text, 2002, Ruth Vanika's Queering India, and Bursan Bhattacharya's 2007, The Phobic and the Erotic. These studies of the many forms of sex and gender queerness point us towards something which we must never take for granted as normal or natural in any way, but work to understand, just as we would work to unpick the threads of caste, class, and other socio-political processes. Increasingly under colonial modernity, impeccable heterosexuality got sutured into impeccable gendering and refashioned ancient ideals of behaviour. the householder life stage got turned into a naturalized image, an identity and an imperative which was tied in with personal futurism and national futurism, and the dual aspirations for development of the self and nation. There's a body of work, especially in the history of science, which traces out for us how this stabilisation of a sex, gender, sexuality system got produced. When 18th and 19th century British science and pseudoscience produced a whole set of interrelated knowledges about race and sex during the Age of Empire and modernity, connected into eugenics, connected into ideas about physical and moral worthiness, and became solidified and validated as knowledge by hegemonic institutions and actors, much of it coming from Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, hegemonic institutions, filtered out and disseminated through universities and public culture, and soon relayed globally and sedimented by colonial modernities. So the British imported a style of masculinity, anchored it into knowledges about the body, which were presented as natural, and then associated to claims for fitness to power. Ashish Nandy, in his landmark text, Psychology of Colonialism, sketched out 3 discernible reactions among Indians to the British charges of effeteness. In a very few instances, cultural nationalists like Gandhi tried to counter with a critique of English styles of masculinity as being brutish and inappropriately materialist. But in many quarters, Indian menfolk reacted to their colonial shaming and stereotyping with a sense of defeatedness. Tanya Luhrmann's classic study of the Parsi community is a very depressing read about self-hatred and the internalisation of colonial norms. So the widest reaction was a fight back and a refashioning of the self, a makeover of the Indian man in the terms now being set by British norms of masculinity. And the reverberations of those reactions have been apparent from the earliest moments of colony right through till now. Religious reformers tried to rework Hinduism into an image of textual, rational philosophy and sober worship. Marriage and styles of family life were reformed and reformed again. And there's not space here today, of course, for us to mention and go over all the many aspects of life which were impacted by this shift in gender and sexualized norms. So I'll talk now about just a couple of arenas. We'll talk about, unsurprisingly, the male body and links to nationalism. The male body and nationalism are intimately linked. Joseph Alter's work has been following the ways in which long-standing ideas about celibacy and the virile power of the masculine substance of semen, when retained and not wasted, most apparent in the body of the trained wrestler. What happened when those ideas met the new demands of modern British virility? Khatri Jain noticed how Hindu calendar art has seen a gradual morphing of deities, especially Ram, especially Hanuman, who have also grown in popularity as against other deities. The morphing of deities, as you can see here, into some kind of global style superhero, complete with six-pack belly, six-pack and enormous arm muscles. Philip Lutgendorf has written about the post-colonial effeminacy anxiety, which we can trace through the rise of the popularity of Hanuman as a preferred deity. Very lately, the ethnographer Mikhail Bass is writing interesting work about the rise of bodybuilding culture in India, the phasing away of traditional wrestling and the replacement of contemporary gym culture and bodybuilding culture. Mikhail is writing about the disappearance of the pot belly. The fact that Modi has to allow his supporters to refer to the size of his chest continually is a symptom of how far this virilization of the male body has gone. Film stars. Oh, on to our next. Yeah, look at the difference in film stars. Look at the difference between our 1960s and 70s hero with his pot belly and his woolly jumper and our contemporary film stars. Yeah, take a photo of that before it goes. It's sobering. Among the many sour aftertastes of colonial masculinities is a taste for militarism, uniforms, parades, armaments, and so on. The imagined stereotype of the non-violent, militarily weak and unmasculine Hindu who is unable to defend himself, and the overcompensatory reactions it has ratcheted up over the years, has led political scientist Dibyesh Anand to coin the term porno-nationalism for the Hindu nationalist nexus of calls to defend Mother India and the pride in armaments. Yeah. Citing political scientist Cynthia Enlow's observation that, quote, nationalism has typically sprung from masculinized memory, masculinized humiliation, and masculinized hope. Anand has tracked Indian domestic and foreign policy to show how gendering and sexualization are not extraneous to nation and international politics, nor secondary byproducts, but stand right at the heart of political imaginings and projects to awful effect. I'm going to change tack a little now. What's my next image? We'll wait for him, shall we? I'll change tack now. Shall we get rid of this depressing thing and we'll have that one up while I talk about my next. Going to talk, as promised now, a little bit about some of my recent work in the Gulf. Because I work in Kerala, I work in the Gulf as well. Of course, the two places are so connected. So I've been doing a lot of work down the years with Kerala migrants in various Gulf states. And what I've found there is that the echoes of colonial stereotype still resound among the South Asian community itself, among the citizen community, and in views expressed by many Arab citizens when they talk about the South Asians who've been living and working among them for hundreds of years now. Colonial stereotypes get relayed backwards and forwards across both sides. I won't be speaking today about South Asian stereotypes, about angry Arab men, but it's there in my writings if you're interested to look it up. So what we have out in the Gulf is a host of abjected others, and they serve as a foil to those who would be able to identify themselves as properly men. So in the Gulf we have women, of course, as we might expect, who stand opposed to the mature Arab man. We have the beardless youth, the young man who's not yet come into his full masculinized, virilized body. We have boyat, or masculine-styled, female-bodied people. And we have migrant Asian males. Migrant Asian men take up one particular space of abjected masculinity in the Gulf. Emiratis in the UAE, where I worked alongside an anthropologist who works with Emirati communities, Emiratis work with a really gross category of Indians. For Emiratis, Indians is not necessarily Indians, it's all kinds. It would include Nepalis, all kinds of other groups. In a familiar kind of way, in this sort of setting, groups get binarized, polarized, and lumped in together. So when Emiratis talk about Indians, they mean all manner of South Asians, with, as we'll see, one interesting exception. So when Emiratis talk about Indians, they allow Indians into various arenas which are meant to be gender segregated and women only. And this was one of our starting points. How can this be? And what we found was that, as with Radhika Chopra's work on male house servants within India, how can it be that men are moving in an allegedly all-women sphere? The answer is that these men are not counted as men at all. They are not threatening, they are not dangerous, they're not disrupting segregated space because they are not socially men. Emiratis gave us talk about Indians which fully reproduced colonial stereotype. Indians are fully feminized, they are small-bodied, weak, compliant and easygoing, dependent and whiny. Indian or Hindi, as I've said, covers Nepalis, Sri Lankans, Pakistanis and so on, with absolutely no differentiation around region at all. But what's interesting is that one exception gets made. Emiratis admire, but fear, the stereotyped figure of the Pathan. The Pathan, for Emiratis, and here, I've left my thing over there, my printer this morning double printed the paragraph, so I'll speak it from memory. The Pathan, Emiratis will tell you, and you will hear this across the Gulf, is dangerous exception to the South Asian rule that South Asian men are safe because not super-virilized. This is the usual crude reading off of bodily morphology to character, to do with things like height and muscle mass. This happens globally in studies of masculinity, and it's one of the global reasons for the effeminization and what Eng calls racial castration, the effeminization of Asian men when set by global standards as put by, this guy here, or Hanuman. So that's part of the story, is the height, the muscle mass. Another part of the story is behaviour. Emiratis will tell us that Pathans will be assertive, argue back, be forceful, they will not be compliant and easygoing, they are not afraid, which makes them very manly to be respected, but also dangerous. And Emiratis will tell us, well, we have from day one never let Pathans work in the household or be near our women. We keep them away, they're out in the countryside, they're doing tough jobs, hard jobs, and they're well away from any place where they may be a danger to our families. So there's this gross hyper-masculinization and production of one particular group and the emasculation, effeminization of everybody else. What's interesting in that ethnography, what was very unexpected to us, it wasn't entirely unexpected to find colonial stereotypes living on. That's confirmation of something, as I say, that we have seen all over the place. But what was unexpected was that Indian men in the Gulf states would react and counter to charges of effeminism with a very interesting set of counter charges. Because in the Gulf, of course, what's happening is that different gender regimes are hitting up against each other, and there's not actually an agreement on what constitutes hegemonic masculinity. We've got different ideas of hegemonic masculinity sliding past each other. Several Indian men would present to me their own version of hegemonic masculinity, which was very familiar to me from India itself. So in a competing set of Indian norms, which themselves, of course, come from this mix of pre-existing ideals reworked after colonial humiliations and accusations, What stood at the centre for many Kerala men of proper adult masculine status was an active, energetic performance as the breadwinner, the worker, the provider for the family. And here, of course, our Indian respondents eagerly pointed out to us the many ways in which Emirati men fail. Living lives of leisure, handing over family responsibilities to servants, failing dismally in their duties as husbands and fathers. The migrant man, for our Kerala respondents, is the very exemplar of the cash-earning good family man and head of the household. I'll just mention another interesting migration study, which you might not have come across. Sheba George has traced another very interesting and common tactic of re-virilization, which is the taking over by men of a new arena as a place to play masculinity. Among the North American Malayali Christian diaspora, Indian men feel emasculated by living in families where the very migration status, the green card, has been obtained via the wife's occupation as nurse. The wife may also be main breadwinner in many of these families. What happens as compensatory activity is that men take on increasingly central and increasingly demanding roles in the Indian churches which bind the diaspora community. The choir, altar service, light church maintenance, they're all tasks in Kerala which are commonly given to women and young folk, but in diaspora the church offers refuge for menfolk and an arena where their threatened position as householder man of substance can be partially recuperated. So let's shift scale now. Let's get to this one. So, recently, Sanjay Srivastava, we're moving from the individual to the national now. Sanjay Srivastava recently, he's among those who's been noticing the transformation of Modi's public masculine self-presentation. Modi masculinity has always been rooted in presenting a forceful, dominating personality, a decisive, action-oriented kind of manliness. But in the early years, that was wrapped up in familiar nationalist aesthetics, khadi, self-containment, restrained consumption, the practices of a virile Hinduism. Lately, Modi's clothing is shifting, Srivastava notes. We're seeing hints of a transformation from sober khadi asceticism to opulent kingly ruler. This is fascinating, and it connects across to something also noted by the anthropologist Teresa Kuldova. She's been doing studies of contemporary Indian fashion and style, and she has noticed the decline of village chic, or a passion for handloom and simple dress. She has noticed the rise post-liberalisation of a very high luxury consumer consciousness and the development of a taste for lavish aesthetics of royal nostalgia. Well, Modi here doesn't look exactly like he's on a Sabyasachi fashion show catwalk, does he? He's not quite getting there. But his style is definitely beginning to pick up elements of another colonial stereotype, the lavish, Mughal, wealthy, luxury, kingly style, an aesthetic which is increasingly stylish in India. The romance of the village appears to be on the back foot for the romance of the urban regal and the borrowing of the power trappings of a phantasmagorical court. So paradoxically, Modi, he's looping right back here with the turbans and the pearls and the trumpeted 56-inch chest. Modi is looping back to a kind of manly aesthetic that resonates with medieval Muslim wealthy and manly substantial aesthetics. If that is what's going on, it wouldn't be entirely astonishing. It would be a very familiar move for anyone studying gender, race, sexuality. It's the same kind of borrowing, it's the same kind of cross-interference of masculine semiotics that we witnessed when white Elvis Presley took on cool black masculinity and made black musical aesthetics and styles palatable and safe but accessible to a white audience. I've written, some of you will know, about film star fan clubs. It's a thing for us. Film star fan clubs and young men's involvement in film star fan clubs in the South. I did a lot of work with young men around their ideals of masculinity, around the various heroes and what they admired, what they liked about different filmy heroes. And something that came out of that work was that Malayali film star Mammootty, who is a Muslim, Malayali film star Mammootty brought to several generations of young men the pleasures and exciting, enticing hints of an alleged Muslim hyper-masculinity, 56-inch chest and all, and more, but wrapped safely up in a hero character of a Savarna Hindu military or policeman or propertied Hindu householder. So I'm coming towards the end now. Oh, there we go. We're waiting for the, this could be the, I don't think we'll get eventually to this outcome, but this is, yes, the Mughal aesthetic on the catwalk, and this is where we are apparently heading with our hegemonic masculinity ideals right now. So let's also remember when we think about gendering, I'm going to talk a bit about some new scholarship now and some potential models. Let's remember when we think about gendering, about the existence of masculine women and of trans men, which is a small group as yet in India, but is growing. Of course, cisgender, biogendered, male-bodied people claim privilege over trans men. When we see masculinity on the body of a person who was assigned female at birth, it's a girl, and then named woman. Or when we see competent and even excellent performances of masculinity on bodies which are not male-bodied in that normative, taken-for-granted sense, it points up for us in a very concrete way what gender theory has been arguing. The fragility of masculinity, the instability of masculinity, and the absolute detachment of masculinity from maleness or from assigned at birth status and gender stories. That can be really upsetting for people who are invested very heavily into those stories or into projects of social convention or normativity. And trans folk sadly find themselves at the blunt end of much gender-based violence. Just as in the arena of caste, atrocities against Dalits and the stark facts of Dalit poverty and unemployment give a shame-faced pause to any glib assertion from any of us that caste is becoming meaningless in contemporary India. In the same way, trans folk are working for all of us at the coalface of gendering and the unravelling of that modernist body, sex, gender, sexuality nexus. When we do gendered analyses, when we think about sex gender, we lose an awful lot if we work in a trans-oblivious mode. There's a recent excellent collection of essays edited by Mori Gokul Singh and Rohit Dasgupta, and there's a very helpful review chapter in there by Mangesh Kulkarni talking about CMS, or critical masculinity studies, talks about the ways in which those studies have been interpreted and impacted in Indian scholarship, and points out to us how every single aspect of social and academic analysis, communalism, healthcare, whatever it is, can be refreshed when we take into account the place which masculinity, the legacy of colonial masculinities, including bionormativity, has played in. So we're not just about adding gender to analysis, we're not just about adding masculinities to our already gendered analysis, we're building in from the outset an appreciation of how important are the dynamics of this nexus and the parts of it. So Dasgupta and Gokul Singh's book is exemplary of recent work that doesn't stop at that social analysis, but goes further to think about what happens if we don't take gender for granted, but we also don't take sex for granted. We also don't take heterosexuality for granted. Let's unpick the whole lot and see what it might do for our analysis if we look at the workings of it. So with those kind of caveats, I'm moving towards a final suggestion now, a final suggestion for the future of masculinities studies, which might be helpful for us all. So first of all, we have to recognise that any study can benefit, as I said at the outset, from remembering and paying attention to the ways in which masculinity is at play. And we'll find over and over again that the morphologies change, the aesthetics, the foundations, they vary enormously over time and space, which is useful for us to see to help us destabilise any naturalised idea of masculinity. But we will also find, and this has always been the tension for us, just as we find enormous variability, we somehow find something that's named as recognisably masculine, whatever they may be, at the heart of dynamics of power, claims to speak, claims to represent and be represented. We've tried out various concepts. Patriarchy, of course, would be familiar to many of you. Patriarchal hegemony has been tried. There's a fine tune to patriarchy. But I'm moving now, as I wind up the talk, to shift decisively away from patriarchy. Patriarchy is a concept I've never used in my own written work, and I've never had truck with it in the classroom. It's too much of a blunt instrument to get at what's going on with masculinities, and it stands in the way, by now, of some much more fruitful conversations we could be having. So I want us all instead to consider stepping back and reflect a bit, very carefully, about what's actually at stake in those situations that we observe where gender is at play. And let's reflect again a little bit about how we might best talk about that and frame our analysis. So as conclusion, I'm going to offer something to those of you who feel the need for a framework that might guide your methodologies, support your gendered analytics, and push forward some real-world alliances and activisms. The concept of kyriarchy might be more helpful to us as we think about how masculinities have shifted over time, how they've been differentiated from each other, how the content of that black box of masculinity has changed through different economic and political moments. Beyond all the changes, and of course what's led so many of us to cling to the desire for some kind of operational master concept like patriarchy, is a recognition of some kind of sociological pattern where some kind of structure seems to be enduring. There we go, get that back up. Seems to be enduring beyond all the content changes. So the academic Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza coined the term kyriarchy specifically as an intervention for feminists, urging feminists to think beyond patriarchy as this blunt instrument of dualism. Onward instead into thinking about the forces at play in kyriarchy, which she did a lot of interesting work on the ancient Roman and Greek polities. Quoting from her, kyriarchy would be a socio-political and cultural religious system of domination that structures the identity slots open to members of society in terms of race, gender, nation, age, economy, and sexuality, and configures them in terms of pyramidal relations of domination and submission, profit and exploitation. So what remains when we try to cross-compare different moments or spaces of Indian life would appear to be expressible as a structural pyramid, whereby one fairly small group of male-bodied people do tend to enjoy a privilege of superior status, command, control, resource over women, but also over other groups of men, youth, Dalits, and so on. From this vantage, we plainly note the ways in which colonialism layered into existing Indian forms some new ideas about masculinities. We notice some new practices of gender and power. We can record different moments of Indian masculinities, like the nationalist one, Sanjay Srivastava's 5-year plan man, or the post-1990s economic restructuring moment, the Sabyasachi luxury hero, the global war on terror mode, our Hanuman, and specific kinds of content. And those moments have ushered in fresh nuance, and they've often reinvigorated old stereotypes like that bloodthirsty, irrational Muslim. Or they've reconfigured the pyramid of privilege a little to allow for the neo-rich, the growth of a luxury goods-consuming new elite. But from the long view, the pyramid remains pretty much stable and constant. The imperial class departed, but Indian society continued. And here, Savarna Hindu, Hindi belt, property-owning, older men have undoubtedly held some kind of advantage. I get a lot of internet memes and jokes about uncles. What is the figure of the uncle reference? I'm closing here with uncle. The figure of the uncle isn't, of course, any literal genealogical or ethnographer's kinship term. It's some kind of attempt to allude to that enduring power, enduring social influence of not just any uncle, but a particular kind of senior man. There's a Malayalam film song that, if I had the time, I'd show you. I can share the link with you. Harry may know it. There's a Malayalam film song which is old but still pops up regularly on the radio and on TV shows. And a young boy asks 3 senior men, you know this one, a variety of mind-bogglingly difficult questions. Why is the moon so bright and so far away? How does this happen? What is the structure of the universe, basically? These 3 men, the uncles in the song, are apparently expected to know the answers to all of these questions. What authority? As the uncles throw this kid around and pass him around between them and swing him up and down, as the uncles do this, their strong and capable bodies show up the smallness, the weakness, and the ignorance of their young charge. Women and girls, meanwhile, are nowhere to be seen here. This story is all about a young boy accepting the hierarchical relations that surround him. The boy willingly accepts their manoeuvres as they swing and throw him about, and he defers knowledge, power, authority, physical mastery to them in exchange for a sense of protection, a sense of affection, and the promise that one day he'll grow up to be an uncle. But what if he began to question their seamless authority? Half of India's population is under the age of 25, with 2/3 under 35, we keep reading. But we also keep reading, according to economic commentators, this is worryingly not apparently producing the expected demographic dividend or an economic boom because of the youth, and an overall, therefore, national boom. Because, commentators say, variously because of a lack of training or a lack of jobs, and we have the spectre of unskilled youth, the spectre of overskilled youth, high unemployment already in place, with exponential increases apparently looming. This, of course, is very bad news for young women and for lower caste folk, as higher caste young men are unable to satisfy their own first come, first served senses of entitlement to what little employments are available. India might not be enjoying the demographers and economists' hoped for demographic dividend in the economic development sphere, but in this millennium, we're all, aren't we, increasingly wary of modernity's economic development as an alternative to social, political, or spiritual development. Winding up. We're no longer in the colonial or even the post-colonial national or even the post-liberalisation boom moments. We're shifting to a global consciousness. Sanjay Srivastava's 5-year plan man is a ghost from the past. Perhaps William Mazzarella's savvy 1990s urban consumerist and Modi's wealthy kingly power are equally on the threshold of being superseded. Much is going to depend on whether the huge majority of young men, joined by young women, and including trans men, are willing and able to push through their voice over the pyramid and bring in real change in education, social practice, and economic endeavour. Might the rule of Savarna Hindu middle class and upper class, normatively sex-gendered uncles be sidestepped by an alliance of young men, young women, with trans men and queer men brought into the fold, Dalit and Muslim men given their voice and permitted their part? Thank you.